a reflexão que desenvolveremos aqui no NUPPAA, num momento particularmente relevante, em meio a uma pandemia que constitui, na realidade, um laboratório de análise e avaliação de políticas públicas, não apenas para as capacidades estatais que foram duramente construídas no passado, mas também para resistir ao desmonte de políticas públicas que observamos em todos os campos, e principalmente para preparar-nos, para preparar novas capacidades e capacitações que serão necessárias no mundo pós-pandemia. Eu gostaria de convidar todos e todas para conhecer melhor o nosso site, onde está o relatório parcial de atividades. Em vez de eu aqui ficar contando a vocês o que é o INCT, o relatório é bastante detalhado, ele é uma peça assim, que eu acho que vale a pena ler. Então, eu insisto, convido todos que vão ao site, que se dirijam ao site do INCT-PPED e que vejam o nosso relatório parcial. Nós começamos em 2009, no ano passado, comemoramos dos 10 anos aqui no encontro do NUPPAA, e eu quero mesmo insistir nesse convite. Então, por isso eu não vou falar do passado, eu vou falar do futuro. Esse evento foi pensado exatamente como uma incursão investigativa sobre o futuro. Daí o seu nome, Desmonte das Políticas Públicas e Novas Capacidades Estatais para o Futuro Pós-Pandemia. A reflexão do INCT ao longo desses últimos, do INCT-PPED, de Políticas Públicas, Estratégias e Desenvolvimento, ao longo desses 11 anos, desenvolveu-se através de eixos temáticos e grandes temas de pesquisa, sobre os quais não vou falar aqui, mas eu gostaria de citar apenas 3. O primeiro teve concentrado sobre a discussão das capacidades estatais, sobre variedades do capitalismo, logo no início da nossa reflexão. Depois, sobre capacidades estatais em países emergentes. E tivemos a felicidade de contar com a contribuição do IPEA, e nessa reflexão nós publicamos um livro que se chama Capacidades Estatais em Países Emergentes. Mas as pesquisas não se limitavam a esses grandes temas. As linhas de pesquisa do Instituto, que são 3 linhas de pesquisa, vão muito mais além e desenvolvem uma reflexão que lhes é própria e, de novo, no relatório vocês saberão mais a respeito. E é finalmente a pesquisa que agora se inicia, de novo em cooperação com o IPEA, que eu queria falar brevemente, e ela se chama Desmonte e Reestruturação de Políticas e Capacidades Estatais para o Mundo Pós-Pandemia. Então, esse trabalho tem como objetivo articular, uma proposta de pesquisa que investigue quais as capacidades estatais que o Brasil, como economia em fase intermediária de crescimento, de desenvolvimento, deve aprimorar ou construir de modo a fortalecer o arcabouço institucional e formular e implementar políticas públicas consistentes com uma agenda de desenvolvimento socioeconômico com grande ênfase na agenda verde. O projeto recupera elementos dessa pesquisa que foi desenvolvida no passado, mas ela está muito focada para aquilo que vem acontecendo no momento e que, sobretudo, será fundamental no contexto pós-pandemia. Então, nós temos, na primeira parte dos nossos termos de referência, um referencial teórico que eu acredito que interesse a todos que estão aqui reunidos no 4º encontro do NUPPAA, porque são temas que vão fazer parte da nossa reflexão e que eu acho que reúnem tanto o interesse dos nossos professores, nos vários INCTs que citamos aqui, dos nossos alunos do Programa de Políticas Públicas, das redes que estão trabalhando com a gente, como a rede da professora Irene Carniato, que vai se apresentar no GT8, e outras que estão aqui, como a Proprietas e como o Instituto de Doenças em Populações Negligenciadas. Então, nós temos um referencial teórico que vai desenvolver a discussão de capacidades estatais, vai ter muito em conta a questão da variável macrofinanceira, vai estar pensando sobre o desmonte das políticas públicas, de um lado, e a resiliência institucional do setor público, do setor público, por outro, a resistência burocrática e as novas capacitações que se fazem necessárias, especialmente para as políticas orientadas por missão. Então, essas reflexões teóricas, elas desagam, ou, enfim, elas têm como objeto alguns eixos temáticos que eu queria rapidamente referir para dar, então, seguimento a essa nossa abertura, né? Os eixos temáticos, então, são, basicamente, aqueles que estão expressos nos grupos de trabalho que nós vamos ter a alegria de desenvolver aqui ao longo do dia de amanhã, né? Em primeiro lugar, a questão do ambiente macroeconômico. Nosso grupo 6 tem alguns trabalhos que vão justamente tratar dessa questão mais macroeconômica. Depois temos uma discussão das questões que dizem respeito às políticas sociais, à desigualdade e renda. Isso, sem dúvida, está bastante desenvolvido no grupo de trabalho 1.1, além do 1.2, que tratará das questões de accountability, transparência e tudo mais, né? Depois temos uma discussão de produção e inovação, que estará bastante desenvolvida no GT4, né? Uma discussão de infraestrutura, de geopolítica e inserção interna, e de temas que perfazem as preocupações das linhas 1, 2 e 3 do nosso INCT-PPED. Então, antes de concluir, e eu lamento que ele não esteja aqui presente, mas certamente ele estará conosco nas conclusões do nosso NUPPAA, eu quero parabenizar o professor Carlos Morel, que é um dos 600 cientistas brasileiros mais influentes no mundo, que foi recentemente publicizado na lista dos 100 maiores cientistas do mundo e que nos enche de orgulho. E quero desejar a todos um encontro com muitas afinidades, com discussões calorosas, um encontro de encantamento com as convergências e com as divergências, que nos fazem, sem dúvida, ampliar o nosso entendimento. Então, tendo concluído essas boas-vindas, eu passo a palavra para o professor Leandro Mendonça para falar rapidamente do INCT Proprietas, que faz parte da nossa conjugação aqui no NUPPAA, no Núcleo de Políticas Públicas, Análise e Avaliação.
Bom, boa tarde a todos, obrigado, Ana Célia. A clássica pergunta, estão todos me escutando? Porque já vi várias vezes as pessoas ficarem falando sozinhas e ter que repetir tudo, porque não fizeram essa pergunta. Bom, já que todos me escutam, é um prazer e uma honra estar aqui acompanhado do PPED e o Instituto de Doenças de Populações Negligenciadas. Acho que a existência dos INCT já é uma questão alvissareiro quando a gente fala das capacidades estatais, que a Ana Célia vem falando muito e é importante. E a importância do nosso encontro, por exemplo, para eu que sou participante do grupo de políticas culturais, que talvez seja o maior exemplo de terra arrasada que esse governo pode dar, é você falar de um sistema nacional que tinha um plano plurianual para 10 anos, que tinha uma série de capacidades implantadas, e você tinha ações administrativas que, uma vez que a prefeitura criava o conselho, fazia jus ao recurso que circulava pelo Ministério da Cultura, e, de repente, em 2 anos, não tem nada. Não tem nada, nem funcionamento, não se acham nem os arquivos, entendeu? Não tem nada. Então, eu estou feliz que a gente possa analisar, estou feliz porque apareceram pessoas querendo estudar políticas culturais, você está entendendo? E apareceram até um número razoabilíssimo pelas dificuldades que a gente tem tido aí, né, diante de todas essas dificuldades da pandemia. Eu não vou falar muito porque eu estou mais interessado depois que na troca que a gente pode ter. É um prazer estar aqui e acho que os 3 INCTs mostram que existe ainda alguma articulação que a gente pode fazer para além do programa dos INCTs para dar ainda mais peso à produção intelectual e à produção institucional que eu acho que a gente é capaz. Obrigado. Eu devolvo para a Ana Célia, não é isso? Que chama o próximo. Então, obrigado a todos. Vamos aí para a nossa jornada do NUPPA de amanhã.
Então, antes de começar a segunda parte, eu queria convidar o professor Alcides Gussi, que é o nosso vice-coordenador do NUPPA, para também dirigir as suas boas-vindas a todos que nos assistem.
Boa tarde. Me ouvem? Agora é a pergunta, né? Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Obrigado, Ana Célia. Obrigado, Leandro. É um prazer estar aqui mais uma vez, já no quarto NUPPA, é a quarta edição do Seminário NUPPA. O NUPPA, eu estava ouvindo a Ana Célia falar do INCT, é um filho, né? Um filho nascido já há 5 anos, né, Ana Célia? Dos INCTs e da tentativa de fazer as interfaces interinstitucionais em rede. A gente sempre pensou em rede, antes de pensar que nós teríamos mesmo que estar em rede, como estamos aqui, né? Era uma forma da gente sempre pensar a interinstitucionalidade dos INCTs a partir de encontros. E esse encontro é muito alvissareiro, porque a Ana Célia falou de futuro. O NUPPA sempre pensou em futuro, em projetar futuros possíveis. Aí eu fiquei pensando, Ana Célia, é o nosso 4º seminário, e para vocês verem que de 2016 até agora, olha, os temas do seminário sempre voltaram para o futuro, para uma prospecção dentro das nossas próprias linhas de pesquisa. Eu, particularmente, trabalho com avaliação de políticas públicas. Agora, mais do que necessário avaliar, no momento de desmonte de políticas públicas, também não se avalia, né? Então, é necessário construir avaliações. Eu estava recuperando, Ana Célia, para um pouco da memória do NUPPA. O nosso primeiro seminário se chamou Estado no século XXI, Análise e Avaliação de Políticas Públicas. É no ano longínquo de 2016. Né? Então, não faz tanto tempo assim, mas já estávamos pensando e prospectando futuros. O segundo seminário de 2017, Pensando e Repensando Políticas Públicas. E o terceiro seminário, aqui, que foi em 2019, portanto, ano passado, Capacidades, Estatais e Inovação. Ou seja, estávamos já falando de futuro. Claro que não tínhamos nem como, não era premonitório para entender o que a gente está passando hoje, a pandemia e o nível de desmonte das políticas que a gente está presenciando, mas a gente já apontava muita coisa. O NUPPA e o seminário têm reunido nos seus grupos de trabalho uma variedade de atores que lidam com políticas públicas, não só da academia. A gente tem recebido muita presença de gestores públicos, é claro, de estudantes de graduação e pós-graduação, e é sempre bom saber também que os INCTs e o PPED têm feito esse trabalho de extramuro, né? Trabalhar justamente com profissionais que estão na linha de frente das políticas públicas nesse exato momento, estão lidando com elas, estão lidando com esse desmonte, e é muito bom saber que esses atores também estão presentes. No mais, eu desejo, como sempre, né, contando a nossa história aqui, né, muito profícua de trabalho, um excelente seminário para todos. Amanhã teremos os GTs, todos serão gravados e disponibilizados. Espero que vocês possam acompanhar também, aos demais que se inscreveram apenas como ouvintes, que possam se inserir amanhã nos GTs. Os links vão estar disponíveis mais tarde para todos acessarem. Então, um bom seminário para todo mundo.
Ótimo, muito obrigada. We can turn on now to English and give the welcome to Professor Heiner Kattel to the opening, the opening conference, whose name is Dismantling of Public Policies, New state capacities, and new mission-oriented policies for the future of post-pandemic. And this session will follow, after the presentation, after Professor Rainer Kattel's presentation, we'll give the floor to the discussants, meaning Professor Maria Antonieta, Alexandre Gomide, Leonardo Bulamarque, Estela. I have to give a pardon because I need Bernardo Calil to speak in this presentation before we go to the second session. I apologize so much. I'm so sorry. Bernardo é o presidente da Associação dos Egressos do PPED. E eu convidei ele para fazer parte. Então, nessa confusão, nessa agonia, eu acabei esquecendo de dar a palavra para ele. Desculpe, vamos retomar depois. Muitas desculpas. Bernardo, a palavra é sua.
Imagina, professora. Obrigado. Obrigado, colegas de mesa, todas e todos que nos assistem. Eu estou aqui em nome dos 18 fundadores, dos 100 associados e dos mais de 300 egressos, mestres e doutores pelo Programa de Políticas Públicas, Estratégias de Desenvolvimento do Instituto de Economia da UFRJ, que se reúne em torno da ALUMNI-PPED em meio a um cenário trágico de pandemia e de ataque à ciência no Brasil, lato sensu, e a universidade pública em particular. Não é a primeira vez nessa história já centenária que a universidade pública no Brasil se vê diante de grandes desafios, mas talvez seja inédito o descrédito e a desconfiança numa instituição-chave para o desenvolvimento de qualquer país. E como estamos entre acadêmicos nesse evento, talvez seja uma boa oportunidade para refletir sobre alguns dos motivos. Nós, da ALUMNI-PPED, acreditamos que a universidade pública se fragiliza quando o fluxo de construção e disseminação de conhecimento por parte do corpo discente é interrompido pelo diploma. Acreditamos que a universidade pública é menos eficaz quando é menos aberta e transparente ao cidadão comum, nosso financiador em última instância. É menos efetiva quando não é capaz de comunicar o que faz, quando abre mão de participar do debate público com afinco, e menos eficiente quando não faz junto com a sua comunidade, aumentando muros em vez de escancarar seus portões físicos e simbólicos para sua própria gente. A sociedade brasileira ainda não está representada no interior da universidade pública e, particularmente na sua pós-graduação, em toda a sua diversidade e igualdade de oportunidades. A ALUMNI-PPED tem como missão encarar esses desafios no seu microcosmo, que reúne de acadêmicos a gestores públicos das mais diversas instâncias, de empreendedores a membros da sociedade civil organizada. Fazer chegar o conhecimento que aqui produzimos aos nossos vizinhos de porta e ao Brasil profundo, incentivar a integração não só entre nossos egressos, mas entre as suas redes, e realizar projetos que levem além muros a potência da universidade pública brasileira. Eis o nosso objetivo. Estamos preparando novidades e nas próximas semanas lançamos nossos canais e plataformas ao público. A ALUMNI-PPED se soma a outras organizações e instituições que encaram esse momento do país com o sentido de urgência que ele merece. É apartidária, mas preza pelos valores democráticos. É conhecimento, mas também é agente. Cumpre o que promete, como acreditamos que a universidade pública deve ser. Era isso. Contem conosco e obrigado pela oportunidade e um bom seminário.
Alvissareira a criação do ALUMNI-PPED. É uma instituição que trará muitas coisas novas para todos nós. Well, let's start the second part of this inaugural session, giving the most welcome to Professor Rainer Kattel. Let me present Professor Kattel, although I think that most of you know him already. Professor Rainer is Professor of Innovation and Public Governance at UCL, Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. He has studied at the University of Tartu, Estonia, and University of Marburg, Germany, in philosophy, political philosophy, classics, and public administration. He led Ragnar Nur's School of Innovation and Governance for 10 years, building it into one of the leading innovation and governance schools in the region. Professor Calil has also served on various public policy commissions, including the Estonian Research Council and the European Science Foundation. He has worked as an expert for the OECD, UNDP, and the European Commission. Currently, he leads the Estonian government's Gender Equality Council and is member of e-Estonia Council, advertising the Prime Minister of Estonia. He has published extensively on innovation policy and governance and specific management issues. I think he can present his talk, his conference, and then I present the others participants of this very interesting second session of opening the for NUPPAA. Professor Heine.
Okay, thanks so much, Célia.
A great, really happiness to have you here. Thank you very much.
Yes, same here. It's so great to see a lot of my Brazilian friends. Haven't seen you for a while, so Alexandre, Leonardo, others. Nice to see you again. And yeah, and thanks for inviting me for this great conference. It's great to see just an academic network of interested in state capacity. I think Brazil has always had a very strong heterodox tradition in analyzing things that really matter. So that's really great to see that this is alive, even in the difficult times we are all living in. So congratulations on that. So let me just share my screen as well. I think Célia also did share my paper, so I won't really go too much detail into the paper that was shared, but rather I will do a bit more general, if you will, a presentation, because yeah, I think the idea of looking at state capacities, of course, has become, particularly with COVID, very relevant topic. Of course, it was also before that, but I mean, with COVID, the state obviously came back. And the question I want to discuss today is, what kind of state is coming back? That is, it's easy to say that yes, government is back, but I mean, you can also have, dumb government. So it's not all governments are the same, or not all governments are smart or do good things. So this is what I wanted to do today, is just sort of to try to understand what kind of government and what kind of state is coming back, and what are the issues that we should perhaps pay more attention to, if you will. And so it's less of an academic presentation, if you will, and more sort of trying to make sense of what is going on, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion as well with you guys afterwards. So if you look at for the context, of course, as you all know, there is even before the COVID, you had quite a lot of headlines actually about the industrial policy coming back. So you had, for instance, in the context of Germany, one of the leading economies in Europe, you had already in 2019, you had a Minister of Economy speaking openly about industrial policy, which hasn't been done in Germany maybe for 20, 30 years. And he was partially doing it in a context of sort of US-China competition and geopolitical positioning of Europe and Germany between these two. But still, it was very much about industrial policy. But the same in the sort of the English-speaking world or Anglo-American world as well. You have this industrial policies back already before the crisis, of course, and then once the crisis hit, you have everywhere, basically, everybody all of a sudden is talking about the state, the big state, the relevance of the state. And again, here it's the German context where you have massive investments by the government. So it's COVID sort of came in time where not only were sort of the cutting edge governments thinking about industrial policy, but many governments around the world were discussing it. And some of the things I want to look at today is why was that the case? Why is industrial policy coming back even before the COVID-19, and why it has to do with the state capacities? There's basically, I mean, one of the key issues, of course, we have is sort of the capitalism the global capitalism we have is very much of increasing value and wealth extraction. So here you have, the Amazon profits going up, and the way Amazon pays federal taxes going, basically nowhere. So it's basically zero taxes paid by Amazon. And of course, other digital platform companies behave the same way. So they are able to arbitrage various tax systems globally and essentially pay no taxes, and at the same time make enormous profits. But at the same as worrying is this look at the comparison of Germany and Korea here. You see what is different Gini indices. One is looking at the disposable income. Basically, this is what the people get actually into their pockets, and the other is market income. And as you see that in Germany, the market income Gini coefficient is actually increasing very, very rapidly. So Germany, if the federal welfare state wasn't there, is incredibly unequal society, and it's getting more and more unequal over the last 40 years. And this is very different to Korea, where basically the disposable income and market income are very similar, which means basically like countries like Germany, the leading industrial economies, are very much increasingly unequal. And at the same time, to keep the inequality from rising, they have to have larger and larger fiscal transfers, basically to uneven the inequality in societies. And of course, this is also not sustainable over a long period of time. So that's why I think countries like Germany are increasingly looking at industrial policy, because they realize that the jobs that they're creating in the economy are not well paying enough. So they need to do something that is different. Otherwise, they just need to have more taxes for social transfers to cover the Gini coefficient differences, and not to have as a high unequal society. So this is something that is first, that a lot of the countries are dealing with this sort of a value extractive capitalism. And if you saw last week, for instance, European Commission came out with a pre-decision on Amazon, and arguing that Amazon has been engaging in uncompetitive practices on European markets. So there is, and of course you had over the last year, you had a number of hearings in the US Congress on the similar issues. So how do you rein in the power of digital platforms that are basically extracting value from the system without paying anything back into the system? And of course, at the same time, also, the global carbon footprint is only increasing at the same as well. So here you see basically that developed countries like Europe, US are at the bottom here, but of course here you have China, India, and others who are very rapidly sort of getting into this middle income bracket, and their carbon footprint is actually increasing at the same time. So it basically puts a huge pressure on cities, but also on migration across the border to US, but also to Europe, from Northern Africa, and so on and so forth. So you have this, another social pressure is coming from the climate migration, if you will. So if you look at the various predictions, you see World Bank is predicting like over the next 15 years, around 140 million people will be migrating from the areas that have a climate emergency, like South America, part of Central and South America, but also North Africa and other areas. So again, this is an enormous pressure on social systems, on urban systems, even in places like Mexico, but actually it's increasing inequality. So even if you don't believe in climate emergency, this becomes an enormous social issue anyway. So even if you don't do anything about climate, even if you don't invest into green technology or green capitalism, it will become an enormous social issue for many of the big cities, but also wealthy countries. That's again the reason to look into industrial policy, and to try to understand the state capacities and what kind of state do we need. And so I think it all boils down to the idea that growth is not enough, basically. That just to have an economic growth and to have a higher growth doesn't really deliver the economy we want. And so this, as I said, this idea of increasing inequality and increasing carbon footprint are more and more becoming the focus of sort of policy and the role of the state in economy discussions. So it's not only about having more exports, more FDI, more whatever, but it's actually about what kind of exports, what kind of FDI. But the question is about the quality of growth. And I think it's also the realization that over the last maybe 20 or 30 years, most countries have focused actually on macroeconomic stability, like inflation targeting, and just generally liberalizing the economies and opening up rather than looking at those other policies like science and technology, employment, environment. And this void between these two policies has been quite enormous. And this is a paper by Mario Simul and others that just came out earlier this year, but basically looked at and then argued that exactly that, if you look at Brazil and Argentina and Korea and China, the difference is that really the macroeconomic policy has been complementing industrial policy. So it's really that many countries, if you look from Latin America to Eastern Europe and Africa and other parts of Asia, really have this void between macroeconomic policies and science and technology or industrial policies. So the government has basically moved out of this or left this enormous void of policy there. And again, this is the reason that a lot of countries are looking at it, well, why do we leave this space open? We actually need to have an industrial policy to deal with that area. And so this is really what you call in literature, there's a lot of talk about this normative turn, how the sort of innovation and industrial policy becomes not only about growth, but really the quality of growth, or as my good colleague Mariana Mazzucato is talking about, it's not only the rate of growth, but also the direction of growth. So it's really about what kind of areas you are investing in and why do we do that. And this is just an example from science and health research, where a lot of the medical trials that were meant for medicines for women were actually done on males up to 1990s, and that led to actually more health problems than before. So obviously, it really matters or who is engaged in policymaking and what is the direction of policymaking. So this idea of having a normative turn in industrial policy is another really key trend or tendency, if you will. And so if you have this context and try to understand what governments are doing, or how they are changing their policies, or what are the key focuses of those policies, and then I would argue that there is a number of issues at stake. So first of all, you have emerging idea that the entire financial sector should actually serve those socioeconomic goals like inequality or green transition. And so here you have last week, I think, or no, last month, Lagarde, who's in charge of the European Central Bank, talking about that the market neutrality is over, basically. You can't have a quantitative easing programs and other central bank activities that are neutral to the market, because they are actually then supporting the carbon lock-in anyway. So if you say that the central banks are just following what the markets are doing, they're actually reinforcing the sort of the carbon lock-in of the financial sector. And here is a research that shows that if you look at how much quantitative easing programs the European Central Bank, for instance, was doing in 2017, it amounted to more than 700 billion euros. And at the same time, sort of the additional investment needed to achieve the climate goals of the European Union was much less than that. So you have enormous sums being spent on financial markets that are actually not changing the economic structure. So you sort of pump into the money into the economy that is still sort of increasing your existing dependency on carbon. And if you go in detail, if you look at, for instance, how German Bundesbank is spending its money, it goes into the helping the car industry, which is one of the biggest polluters, and so on and so forth. So you have this enormous financial resources on those markets being spent without any real direction or without any real sort of understanding why should we do anything differently. And so you have increasing sort of need to actually manage the finance for achieving, lowering the inequality, having better jobs, having the, reaching the climate targets. So this idea of directing or managing finance is becoming more and more important. And also in terms of how do you create either financial regulations that are actually helping to do that, and how do you create also financial assets that are then actually helping financial actors to do that. So either you regulate the banking sector more towards green transition, or you also create financial assets. And you see that some of the countries are actually using COVID recovery packages exactly for that. So you have here is Energy Policy Tracker is a great website where they track what are countries spending their money on, basically, whether it's green or whether it's fossil, and whether it has any conditionalities on the government spending or not. And you see actually countries like Germany, for instance, are spending almost half of its COVID recovery package, which is close to 60 billion euros, on sort of clean energy projects. So they understand that finance has to be directed towards those goals that are interesting for us, rather than just having growth. And so if you go back to even to 2008 and 2009, where German government was reacting to the financial crisis, it was very much actually just sort of supporting the existing industrial structure rather than focusing on restructuring the economy. So it was helping to buy, people to buy new cars, basically, and things like that, and building roads, which are of course also just increasing the carbon footprint. So you see that some of the countries are doing quite a lot, and other countries are doing much less in that response. And so another issue, of course, and which Célia mentioned in the beginning, this idea of mission-oriented policies. So you have, European Commission has dedicated much of its R&D budget, which is around 100 billion euros, towards specific societal goals and achieving them through R&D. And Mariana, of course, wrote the main report for that. Last week, also there, Latin American countries, I think with the support of EIDB, Mariana and Catano Bena, I think who's a good colleague of many of us, published a report also of examples in Latin American countries. And what I wanted to specifically sort of bring out is I think really interesting examples from Sweden. So the idea, how do you use R&D policies to achieve societal goals, is really, in that sense, very demanding task, because you need to be able, and this is where the state capacity, of course, becomes really interesting. You need to be able to formulate cross-sectoral goals. Otherwise, of course, everybody just wants, Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Health, they just want more money anyway, because everybody wants more money for research, to support companies. So you just sort of fall back into your old structure. So how do you change that? How do you change course? And I think Sweden has done a really interesting way of it. The first mission they have is, we want to make sure that everybody in Swedish schools, every child in Swedish schools is eating healthy, sustainable food. But that means, of course, that you really need to work with everybody in the food value chain, the producers in agriculture, to the waste of food as well, to the import of food. So you need to be working with everybody that their food is actually sustainable. And as you might know, if you look at countries like Sweden or UK, probably the same is true in Brazil. One of the largest carbon emissions actually come from food, and especially from food waste and the way we produce food. Of course, meat has incredible importance there. So how do you make our diets less meat heavy, less carbon heavy, becomes a cross-sectoral issue. But at the same time, if you define it in a way that every child in every school eats healthy food, everybody understands that. If you tell that to the 15-year-old, they understand it. It's not some abstract policy goal that we want to have 50% of whatever, more FDI, or who cares about foreign investments? I want to have healthy food. So it's very easy to understand this goal. And it is, of course, by nature, is a cross-sectoral. And of course, by nature also, it's not about R&D only, but it's actually changing the behavior. So if you manage to achieve this mission, it means that you change the behavior of entire generation, because everybody learns to eat differently in school. So they eat differently for the next 50, 60 years. So and I think this is why it's such a massive, massively interesting way of doing it. And the same way, the other mission they have is to how do you make sure that every street in Sweden is healthy, sustainable, and vibrant? Which means, again, it's about lowering the carbon footprint, but also that means you need to think about transportation systems. You need to think about how do we get small businesses back on streets. So it's not only about R&D and spending more money in R&D, or it's not even about growth, but it's actually a very different way of living, if you will. And again, it means that you need to get very different ministries to work together to achieve this goal. So I think these are like really interesting examples of what governments are doing in this sort of mission-oriented policy space. Of course, a lot of governments are all just using their old existing policies and calling them missions as well. So there is also a lot of what we call like mission whitewashing going on as well. But another really interesting example is about mission-oriented demand, or especially using procurement. So this is from government from Denmark. Again, I think they came out last week or 2 weeks ago with the idea to use most of the public procurement. And if you look at the country like Denmark, the public procurement is about 20% of GDP. They spend, there's a lot of spending that goes through public procurement. And so they want to use mostly that most procurement is somehow green. It has to be spent on green activities. And it's about, setting a direction for the economy. But it's also, if you look at the example, it's really interesting, at the state employees, the way they eat their lunch. So we want to have the lunch 2 days a week is vegetarian. Again, it's less meat content because a lot of the carbon footprint comes from meat. And also that 60% of the food is organic. So again, you generate demand for, or you change the nature of demand in the entire value chain. So it doesn't mean that the government goes and micromanages all those businesses. They just set the demand very differently. And so the value chain has to change accordingly. But of course, it also means that this kind of activities, you will have learning curves, you will have innovation, because there's now a lot more innovation. There is also a lot more demand for that. So it's again a very smart way of directing, if you will, your activities without having perhaps a very clear mission, but you just want to have less meat and less carbon footprint in the food chain, if you will. And then I think there's a lot happens in a digital space. I think you have this sort of new agencies emerging. This is a government digital service here in UK that has become very much of a blueprint for digital agencies across the world. And it's all about sort of opening up the public sector and the public services to bring in sort of new, create new capabilities into public sector. So how do you bring in software engineers, designers, and also new kinds of research methodologies like user-centric design? So how do you get more co-creation, if you will, into public services and open it up to people who are maybe not working with the public sector on a day-to-day basis? And it's also really about looking at how do we kind of redefine the metrics of how government is operating. So it's very much sort of moving away from just cost efficiency. How do we save money? But it's also what is the value that we're actually offering to citizens? So yes, we can offer better digital services, but what does a better digital service actually mean? And in many ways, this also leads to this sort of reshaping the partnerships with, especially in the IT, which means working with, how do you go away from working with very large digital companies like Amazon's, Microsoft's, Dell's, and others, to working with a lot of small local companies. And this is what the digital government digital service here in UK did. If you go back 10 years ago, almost 90% of government IT was spent on 8 companies. So it's like UK's government expenditure on IT is around 16 billion dollars. So it's a huge chunk of money. If that goes to 8 companies, it leads to very large projects, and many of those projects were failures because they took a long time. What came out of it was really bad services. So now if you look at, they created what's called digital marketplace, which opens up the contracts, or the contracts were actually broken up into much smaller contracts. So you have contracts around $100 million and less. And now you have around 5,000 companies working or getting 80% of the government IT expenditure. Again, you sort of reshape the marketplace as you go along. But of course, what it means is because government now works on a day-to-day basis with small IT companies, these companies are mostly actually much more cutting edge because they are at the cutting edge of technology. They are competing on a daily basis of creating better software. So they're actually much better in actually writing a new code for you. And very often they're also working on open platforms. So you're not locked into a Microsoft product for the next 10 years and you don't have to service it. So this sort of reshaping the marketplace, I think, becomes a very powerful tool. And I said this blueprint, if you go to Canada, Italy, many of those countries, they try to copy this new blueprint of especially breaking up the digital procurement, and this is one of the more interesting examples. And just to bring an example from Germany, how Germany tries to sort of combine those various issues. Here you have the very well-known example of KfW, which is the BNDES of Germany, of course. So, and you see here the increase of green investments that they're doing. So it's basically six-fold increase from in last 20 years. It goes from 4.5 billion euros to 26 billion euros at its height. So it's increasingly investing into climate technologies, and of course this is why Germany became the leader in solar energy storage units, for instance. And this, of course, is very much the idea of how do you direct the finance. But at the same time, here it's also the last year Germany came out with a new sort of high-tech strategy, or 2025, where they have various types of missions, and so they try to coordinate their various activities. At the moment, I think it's very much sort of coordination activities, but they're still trying to reconfigure their entire R&D system towards solving specific problems. As you know, Germany has a very much sort of an incremental innovation system because it's very much driven by industry. So industry is sort of incrementally innovating and being very good at it. So government is now taking the role of trying to set a sort of a more stronger direction for this industrial innovation, if you will. And it's looking at cancer, but also battery cells, intelligent medicine, and so on and so forth. I guess they are not as successful in framing the missions as, for instance, Sweden was. I think Sweden was much better in framing the mission in a way that everybody understands. So if you tell somebody that Germany's mission is around battery cells, most people have no idea what that is. But if you tell somebody that our mission is around what children eat, everybody understands. So it's a much stronger, but it's an example of how countries are trying to combine those various tools. And so now, once we come to COVID, I think you really have a what's called like innovation dividend. So countries or places or cities like here in Barcelona that they're already doing strong innovations beforehand are now sort of using this space. So Barcelona is trying to super blocks in the city, in the middle of Barcelona, to have car-free zones. But it's not only car-free zones, they also have, all this data that is generated in these zones is actually owned by the citizens. So it's not actually that the data is owned by Google or those big companies, but they use this sort of the dividend that they had before to reinforce their practices and try to really change the way city functions almost. So I think and you see it across East Asia as well. You see places like Bangladesh or other places that they use their, for instance, Bangladesh was able to use their existing digital infrastructure to push payments to the citizens very quickly. So once you had COVID hit, they just were able to rely on their pretty good digital infrastructure, and the same with Pakistan. So it's the governments are using their previous innovations that were working well to push them along as well. And I think what's becoming increasingly clear as this sort of the idea of investment into long-term capacities becomes incredibly important. Here is a reaction of or a sort of how Vietnam has been so successful is that they actually learned from the previous SARS crisis 15 years ago. They invested in public health and they invested in tracing systems and all that. So that's the reason they have been keeping it so low. And really the counterexample comes from UK. The UK used to be the leader in preparedness for pandemics. And then when the COVID hit, before that, a lot of this was privatized and outsourced to private companies. And what you had now, as you might have seen, the advisor to the Prime Minister, Dominic Cummings, who just left the government, he was very much in charge of trying to create a basically privatized system of very central tracing and tracking of the COVID cases, which completely failed, spent billions of pounds. But at the same time, you had local systems, local councils, local governments that were used to doing it, that they were completely bypassed. So I think it's interesting that those long-term capacities in health, for instance, take a long time to build up, but it's very easy to get rid of them. So you can also wipe them out very quickly if you have, as I said, a dumb government. So the state can be back, but it doesn't mean that it's every state or the way it is back is not very much necessarily efficient. And I think there is an increasing understanding that we need to redefine what we mean by efficiency. So efficiency has become very short term. Government needs to spend less money and get more return out of it. And this sort of austerity thinking has driven to this thinking why many places, like in UK and other places, you had a lot of the health sector was actually privatized. And once the crisis hit, you had no response because you couldn't coordinate the response as quickly. And here is an article that really looked at why Germany was so good at the crisis response. And of course, it was because they spend more money partially, but also because the system was very decentralized. So you had German federal states had their own crisis systems and their own PPE systems, their own hospital bed requirements and whatnot. So not only were they funded more, but they also had what you can call is a redundancy. Basically, they didn't need as much of the system as much was there. But once the crisis hit, we actually realized this is much more efficient than to have perhaps a stripped down version of public health as the UK does. So it's not only about spending more, but it's also how do you build the systems of public services, and this, what does give you the resilience, and how do you define resilience? I think becomes really important part of state capacity. Are we able to define what is resilient health system, and can we actually keep it going even when we don't have a crisis? So can we fund a system that is more decentralized and hence also more resilient? But the same goes also for manufacturing, of course. Again, you have countries like UK, but also US and others that couldn't really respond to the crisis quickly enough because the value chains were dispersed across the globe, so they couldn't actually ramp up the production as quickly as they wanted. And so this really is how do we develop a local manufacturing for this to be more resilient for our society's need? It becomes another really key issue for state capacity. And as has been already talked about, especially in procurement, this dynamic capabilities to react very quickly through procurement processes has become one of the the backbones of a successful crisis management. And here is A.K. Hyman talking about how this procurement and ability to ramp up procurement very quickly was really at the bottom of the successful crisis management. And especially if there is the use of good open data and good open systems was really important, that you could ramp up the procurement very, very quickly. But also what becomes increasingly important is, of course, also the expertise matters, so that you need to have people in the public services who actually know what they talk about. So not only general manager or people who have general managerial skills is not enough, but you need to have people who really actually understand not only medicine, but also production, engineering, all of those things that you need. So again, this idea of outsourcing and undermining the capacity that used to be perhaps previously in government became so obviously important. And again, it's not only in public health, but also in just engineering. So how do you devise procurement contracts without having engineering knowledge? It's impossible. Again, you go for large scale contracts, you delegate this contract writing to somebody like Deloitte, and then they write you a contract for 10 billion pounds, which probably will be late and will not deliver what you need. So you need to have real engineering expertise actually to be able to do that. And just lastly, I think there is this emerging issues if you think about state capacity out of the crisis. One is really the idea of looming private debt crisis. So that there is a increasing private debt, but also that very likely leads to the necessity for the governments to own large segments of the economy, because government is now lending money. A lot of governments are lending money to the private sector. But if you look at the developments, it's very likely that you will actually need to own large segments of the economy. So how do you manage those sectors of the economy? And so, the way that the financial crisis used to be managed, whether you create like a bad bank, you create like a bad industrial company that the government's own. So how do you manage those assets becomes an enormous issue, I think. And the same way, I think a lot of governments are already now thinking, how do we pay back all this money that we have borrowed, especially governments that do not own their own currency, like European countries in the Eurozone, for instance, or governments that are really dependent on foreign borrowing. So how do you pay back? And so you already now have sort of, whether we increase taxes and all that. So the increasing wave of austerity is something that we need to already now think about. How do we counteract that? How do we build again capacities for that? And I think there is also this idea that, are we really able to build back better after COVID-19, or we just go back to the consumption patterns, production patterns that we are used to, mobility patterns, transportation patterns? Are we going to fly again, consume more meat, cheap fashion, all that? So that we just and I have my quite strong doubts actually here that we are just yes, we want to build back better, but I think it will be quite difficult. So what kind of state we are seeing? So I would argue that we are sort of seeing Weber is meeting de Tocqueville here. So Alexis de Tocqueville is the great French political scientist from the mid-19th century. And of course, on the one hand, we have really this sort of a neo-Weberian state is coming back. Expertise is really important. Long-term planning and resilience are really important again. But also this sort of domestic production capacities that we are really talking about our own, understanding our own economic sectors, engineering skills, and really being able to plan for our economy. It's very sort of a Weberian state, I think. And on the other hand, you have this sort of Alexis de Tocqueville, who was really very much, he liked really the very much sort of democratic governance of towns and cities. So that it's very sort of agile and very much looking to respond to what citizens need. So this idea of having much more non-neutral state actually that is really looking to missions as these very normative goals. Like if you look at the examples of Sweden and Denmark around what you eat, it's a very normative choice by the government to say you have to eat more vegetarian food. So we are not really used to that, I think. So you have a much more a stronger state, but of course this needs to have a quite strong consensus that really people are actually buying into that somebody tells you that you have to eat twice a week vegetarian food. So this is people need to buy into that. But it's also very much this agile responsiveness, as I saw especially in procurement practices, that you're able to devise contracts that are small, but also that give you this solutions that you need actually. But this means that you're able to work on a continuous basis with small companies, maybe thousands of small companies. And also at the same time, sort of this reliance and the importance of global movements like green, Me Too, and feminism, but also Black Lives Matter and indigenous people. And so if you look at New Zealand, for instance, the indigenous people, the rights of indigenous people are really at the forefront of their budgetary discussions. So I think these are all, yes, you have this Weberian element, which is really the core of your government, if you will, this long-term expert-driven. But at the same time, then it's very much around ethical issues, normative goals, and how do you marry those, I think will be really the key challenge for state capacity development. How do we put together, like Black Lives Matter and Weberian structures? Because of course, Weberian structures are very much relying on existing educational systems. So they are actually, in many ways, they are replicating the existing inequalities as well. So how do you get more voices into your existing bureaucracies? How do you make them more representative becomes as important as expertise. But here I think I'll stop because I've spoken long enough. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very, very much for this splendid talk conference. Very well. Yes. Very well. I don't know if Antonieta, I will give the floor to you, but if you prefer to be the second one to speak, it doesn't matter, but I need to present all of you. So, Antonieta, I think that she had a problem with internet, went out and come back.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
I'm here. Okay.
It's no problem that you'll be the first. I'll introduce you.
Okay.
Or do you prefer to be the second one?
I can be the second one as you wish.
Okay, so let me introduce then Professor Leonardo Bulamaki. I'll give the floor to Leonardo Bulamarque. He's professor at Department of Economic Evolution, State University of Rio de Janeiro, research scholar at the Lev Institute, Economics Institute, Bard College in New York. Is also adjunct professor at graduate program in public policies and development strategies at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and head of research of Multidisciplinary Institute for Development and Strategies, MINDS. He's also a member of International Joseph Schumpeter Society and a contributing editor to the Post-Keynesian Economics Forum. Previously, he has a senior program office at the Ford Foundation in New York, directing the Reforming Global Financial Governance Initiative. He has a PhD in economics, awarded by the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Bulamarque has thought, written, and published extensively on innovation and competition, development strategies, intellectual property, institutions, and economic change. I'll not quote all the words, but I give the floor to Leonardo. Leonardo, thank you for being with us. It's always a pleasure. Você está sem som.
Now you can hear me. Okay. So, good afternoon. Probably almost good evening to Rainer. Rainer, is really great to actually see you and also talk to you, because it's been a long time. We don't do it. And let me just start. I think we have to be quick, right? And to say congrats. It was, as usual, a great presentation and also a great paper that I read. Very innovative. So I will just raise 2 points, okay? The first one relates almost to your last slide, which is the macro-financial architecture, which I will raise it as a key economic problem, and even more as a political problem. So that's why I think it should be front and center. And I think it's maybe not, at least it's not in the paper, and maybe not even in the presentation. It emerges at the very end. And the second point I will raise is about innovation bureaucracies in Asia. So first point first. When discussing anything, I think Minsky, among others, but I will choose Minsky. He taught us to ask about, first thing, who's going to pay for it and how? And I think this applies especially to the public sector, given that the neoliberal ideology and the household economics are still in place, as we know, okay? Let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. I think right now, we're living in the so-called Hamiltonian moment. Okay, we're there, but I don't think it will last. Why? Because I think that the ghost of Trichet, Jean-Claude Trichet, not Mario Draghi, this is the one that is around the corner. As well, not the ghost, but the very, very, very much alive Mitch McConnell is ready to shoot and block any kind of effort that the Biden administration might try in terms of rebuilding US state capacities. So given that, in Brazil, of course, we have a finance minister who is the biggest fan on Ricardian equivalence. Okay, and also a big fan of magical thinking. So if we think about the world, I think we're in a very complicated moment in terms that what we have right now is not bound to last. So if we take that on board, I think to get the macrofinance right is crucial. And what do I mean by that? It's precisely what you suggested in your almost like next to the last slide. we have to understand better and publicize it better, the way sovereign currencies work, okay? We have to get a better understanding and also publicize how is the management of public debt? What can we do about that? It's not household economics, but that's what is there. That's the neoliberal ideology. That's what we learn. Almost every one of us learned in not only undergrad, but grad school as well. So I think in that sense, as you raised, the European Union is a particularly complicated compound because it's not a sovereign currency issuer. So of course you have solutions for that. But then is where I think that, well, number one, the financial fiscal architecture should be front and center. And then I think that this is first and foremost a political problem, even more a political problem than an economic problem. Why? Because it's a problem of congresses and parliaments being able to authorize the kind of expenditures and budgets. So that's a political issue. It depends on politics. So it's politics, stupid, should be maybe the new slogan here, right? The second point I want to raise is about innovation bureaucracies in Asia, okay? You know, you have a book coming on that. The paper is great in suggesting the need to articulate and build a link in between Weberian bureaucracies and the whole literature on that and the dynamic capabilities approach. And I think you're absolutely right about that. But I also would like to suggest that theory learns from history, right? At least in the social sciences. And there, I think Asia is the place to learn from. You cited a lot of examples about Europe, and in the paper, you cite several times Asia there. But I don't think that the link that I think it's sort of in the DNA of the Asian developmental state, I don't think it's sufficiently explicit there. What is that DNA? I think it's precisely what you're thinking in terms of theorizing, which is Weberian bureaucrats behaving in a Schumpeterian way. The Asian developmental state, I think, gives us plenty of examples of that. If you start with Meiji Japan, or with the Manchurian bureaucrats, the Japanese bureaucrats in Manchuria, who created the MITI, right? And then the whole Japanese growth explosion in the 60s, and the 50s and 60s. And even now, the BOJ, the Bank of Japan, is a big innovator. It did everything the US and the Fed is doing since 2008. It was doing in the 90s already. So those are bureaucracies, Weberian bureaucracy, that acted in a Schumpeterian way, I think almost all the time. Lee Kuan Yew was a big, almost like not the inventor of that, but he was a big promoter of that. What else here? Well, we could talk about Taiwan, we could talk about South Korea. They learned and they changed and they behaved in a very much Schumpeterian way. So again, that link, I think, should be made explicit in terms of, okay, this happened here, there. How do we theorize that? How do we incorporate that in terms of the theory? And lastly, like China, I think, is the biggest, maybe the biggest example of that. China wants to become, as you know, a giant Singapore. And that's precisely what they were doing since then, since the special economic zones, when they began, to bring it to now to the present, the OBOR, the Belt and Road Initiative. Those are very, very original ways of propelling growth, not necessarily in the best direction, but in the sense of merging, putting together the Weberian bureaucracy component and the dynamic capabilities component. So I think this is something that should be studied closely if you want to advance theoretically on that road. And this not only in terms of the paper, which I think is brilliant, so it would profit from incorporating this. And I also suggest it would be a good thing to give some more weight and some more attention to the what I call the macro financial architecture. That's what I had to say. Thank you very much, Ryan.
I'll make a suggestion that we have 2 discussants, then your answers, and then two more discussants, okay? So I give the floor to Antonieta. Maria Antonieta, to the dear Maria Antonieta Leopoldi. Are you here? Yes.
Yes.
Antonieta holds a degree in social science from the State University of São Paulo, a master's degree in political science and sociology from the University Institute of Research of Rio de Janeiro, and a doctorate degree in political science from the Faculty of Social Science, University of Oxford. Postdoctorate at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Professor of Department of Political Science at Federal Fluminense University of Rio de Janeiro, working at the Graduate Program in Public Policy, Strategies and Development of Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, coordinator of research area in the INCT with a project in the area of strategic elites and development, and state capacities with a view to international insertion of Brazil, areas of interest, macroeconomic policies and development, state and international political economy, institutions and state reform, Brazilian multinational corporations. She was a fellow of the Ford Foundation, Fulbright, and Hewlett Foundation. Antonieta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed a lot the talk by Dr. Kittel, and I think I like very much the tentative to join Weber and Tocqueville to think about a new state. And what I will try is to think about Brazilian states under this approach in which we could consider new Weberian state and proactive non-neutral state. Brazil has had in the last decades expertise in some areas. And I would say that in health and in energy, especially in oil and electric energy, Brazil has shown a lot of expertise, had a public bureaucracy very well prepared, but it has passed a big change recently. First, the reforms with privatization and liberal reforms, and then the last measures of the present government, which points to dismantling some areas of Brazilian policies. So instead of living a moment of building up the state, we live a moment of dismantling some sectors, policies, and institutions, including that institutions that we had good expertise. So thinking about the future of Brazil and the Brazilian state, I would like to stress 2 areas in which we could think of building mission-oriented policies. The first is the relationship between entrepreneurs and states. Brazil was having very good relationship among entrepreneurs and states concerning climate and health, with the pharmaceutical multinational industries and with automobile industries. In the last decade or 2 decades, we had projects in terms of preparing these industries, these big industries, for innovation incentives to control emissions, and we had a good prospect for transforming these sectors into a collaboration, state and big industry concerning a future of a better climate and innovation. But everything stopped at this moment. The second sector I would comment is the capacity we have to govern data and digital platforms. We had elections, local elections yesterday, and we had the results at night. We know who are the majors and the servants in the civil government assemblies in all cities of Brazil. We also have good digital platform for health because of the pandemics we had, because of the epidemics we had. So when COVID came, we had access to information immediately because we have this network of digital information that goes to the very, very low civil servants at the local level to the Ministry of Health. So we could enlarge and increase the expertise of these digital platforms. This vocation, I think the Brazilians have for digital life and building digital platforms for controlling health. But if we look at the control of poverty, Brazil has no information at all, no digital platform. And when the government decided to give the emergency help to 60 million of Brazilians, there was no digital platform to control who could be entitled to receive or not. So I think this is what the future reserves to us. In terms of knowing our poor population, the inequalities we have, we need a digital platform. This, I think it's a legacy we have, something that we have to learn for the future is to have better digital platforms for dealing with inequality. That's what I had to comment.
Heiner, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much for excellent comments for both Leonardo and Antonietta. So thank you so much. And yeah, I think just starting from Leonardo's and then going quickly through them. Yeah, I completely agree with both. So as you would expect, probably, knowing that we have discussed those issues before. And of course, as you mentioned, the key problem of looking at the government budget as a household economics is really one of the key problems coming out of the COVID crisis. I think for many governments and for many political environments, this will be the key discussion whether there is enough coalition or there is a strong enough coalition to change this. And I think some countries might have a good beginning here, but I think the problem they're facing is that the right-leaning parties have a strong momentum, if you will, because of they are so much relying on identity politics and all these kind of issues, and they don't really care about capitalism in a funny way. So if you look at Trump or if you look at Johnson here, or if you look at Hungary and Poland and all those right-wing governments, they really don't care about capitalism. So they just do go very, very strongly for various identity politics, and they're not interested in public budget. So what we have a problem is that I think that the left governments or the left parties, left-leaning parties, haven't really woken up to the idea of looking at public budgets, not through the household economics. So I think in that sense, the left, the unions and other left-leaning political forces are really the key here, I think, in many ways. But also, I think also, of course, academic debates are so important. Partially, I think you can argue that that because of the public ownership of a lot of the assets, I think going forward, many countries will have to somehow deal with that issue in a more serious way. Not only looking at public budgets, but also how do we pool the assets that governments have piled up, basically. How do we deal with that? And I think this provides perhaps an opening to have less ideological discussions there. But I mean, yeah, as you say, I'm not very hopeful either, as you are not. So unfortunately, this macro financial architecture is really the key problem. And as about Asia, I think the question is partially also of cultural context. I think so that probably is much more conducive or open to a stronger state involvement in the life, economic life, but also social life. So you have this partially the Confucian sort of religious background, I think, in many ways that is very important. I think that is much more open to respecting tradition, respecting the elders, respecting the state. That I think that both in Latin America and also in European context is perhaps not so given. I think that's why you have that innovation bureaucracy can be much more successful in the Asian context. But I completely agree that there's a lot to learn, and especially if you look at the COVID responses, there is a lot to learn from Vietnam, Thailand, Bangladesh, all of those places that were have been much more effective than countries like Italy and other places that we think are so developed. So absolutely. And then with Antonietta, I think without going too much into Brazilian context that all of you know so much better than I do. But I think you're thinking that if you start to once you start to apply the mission-oriented approach in the Brazilian context, that one of them should be around industries, I think is a good idea, and that the other one is around poverty is also an excellent idea, because obviously this is one of the key challenges for Brazil, is the inequality and poverty. So how to tackle that is a really strong argument. Thanks.
Antonietta?
You want me to say something? I can just put a couple of phrases just to complement what Rainer just said, which are, I think that what was also in your next to last slide was the question of new austerity versus then the responses that you mentioned in Asia, etc. And you have something very important there, which is, okay, with the current policies by the central banks and well, the treasuries, in some places at least, the government is becoming a big, let's say, controller, right? I'm not sure if owner, but at least it has the potential to control a lot of what's going on, of sectors, etc. On the other hand, we all know that beyond COVID, we have an artificial intelligence revolution coming. We have a revolution that's gonna put everything upside down in terms of work and the relationship in between work and income and employment, etc. So in that sense, I think maybe the floor will have to open up to bring back the discussion about the socialization of investment, which used to be a very important discussion in the post-war era, and then it vanished with the neoliberal takeover. But just to finish, in Asia, again, the whole developmental state was built on a strategy of socialization of investment. So again, they probably will be best positioned to take this on board than most of the West. So I leave it just as a thought and maybe a provocation. Thanks.
Thank you, Leonardo. Let me give the floor now to Professor Estela Maria Neves, Estela Maria Soares Costa Neves. He has an interdisciplinary training with a degree in architecture and urbanism from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And then in urbanism, Université de Paris 8 as his master in urbanism, and a PhD in social science from the Federal Rural University of Rio de Janeiro. He currently develops postdoctoral research on water governance and local governance, having recently completed postdoctoral research on water governance and water safety. He's part of the permanent faculty of graduate program in public policies, state strategies and development, responsible for the courses of policy, environmental governance, and decentralization. Since January 2020, she advises the board of Brazilian College of High Studies, Science and Culture Forum of Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Its current research program focuses on environmental policy and governance and water governance in a decentralized context. I think this is sufficient. Stella, the floor is yours, please.
Obrigada, Ana. Boa tarde a todos. Boa tarde, professor Catel. Eu fui informada de que a língua portuguesa ali é familiar, então eu vou falar em português. Eu ouvi com muito interesse a sua exposição, pensando, levada a pensar, melhor dizendo, em que lições o Covid nos traz para definir que estado é que nós precisamos no pós-Covid. E, por várias passagens da sua exposição, eu estou convencida de que ela aponta para centralidade da área de política ambiental e para uma área onde a gente tem que construir políticas orientadas por missões efetivas e também para a importância de construção de capacidades estratégicas no setor público, no campo ambiental. Bom, eu acho que a primeira lição que o Covid nos trouxe é que nós não aprendemos as lições anteriores que nós poderíamos ter aprendido com as doenças zoonóticas que precederam o Covid. O Covid não foi a primeira doença transmitida de animais silvestres para os seres humanos. Nós tivemos em 2002 a SARS, nós tivemos a gripe aviária em 2004, tivemos a gripe suína em 2009, o ebola em 2014, enfim, Zika, febre do Nilo. Então, basicamente, o que essas doenças zoonóticas nos ensinam é que elas vêm de uma relação desequilibrada que nós temos com o ambiente natural. Na verdade, na medida em que nós destruímos florestas, ecossistemas naturais, para criar espaço para atividades urbanas e atividades econômicas, a gente degrada as barreiras de proteção natural entre seres humanos e animais. E isso é um assunto por excelência da área de política ambiental. As emissões de gases de efeito estufa, principalmente aquelas que vêm dos combustíveis fósseis, elas alteram a temperatura e a umidade do planeta, o que afeta diretamente a sobrevivência de micróbios e outros micro-organismos. Então, que rapidamente podem se transformar em vetores de doenças emergentes. Foi muito mencionada, várias vezes mencionada na sua palestra, a questão da demanda por carnes e laticínios, que no Brasil, então, levou a uma enorme expansão de áreas de cultivo uniformes, de monoculturas e de pecuária intensiva. E, normalmente, esses rebanhos também servem de ponte entre a vida selvagem e infecções humanas. E a Covid mostrou também a necessidade de uma grande preocupação com os mercados informais, onde esses animais selvagens são guardados e vendidos vivos em condições insalubres, sem qualquer controle sanitário, né? E também, na questão do manejo da agricultura intensiva, o uso excessivo de remédios antimicrobianos fazem com que os patógenos fiquem cada vez mais resistentes, pedindo, assim, com urgência, uma revisão da maneira pela qual é praticada essa agricultura intensiva e o uso de antibióticos. Então, a principal maneira estratégica da gente se proteger dessas zoonoses é impedir que se destruam essas áreas naturais, e fortalecer cada vez mais uma integridade dos ecossistemas e uma biodiversidade que ajuda a controlar por meio de uma maior diversidade das espécies, né? Então, o programa para o meio ambiente, o PNUMA, do UN System, desde 2016, que ele denunciava a iminência desse perigo de doenças zoonóticas como Covid. Então, eu saio dessa palestra convencida de que nós temos que lutar para desenhar políticas orientadas por missões num período pós-pandemia na área ambiental e, basicamente, no Brasil, convencida de que nós temos que resistir a essa devastação que, como a professora Antonieta citou, vem promovendo como política de governo o desmonte da política ambiental e a destruição das capacidades estatais em meio ambiente, e que a gente possa, no meio da destruição mesmo, ir pensando em formas de reconstrução desse patrimônio que, inclusive no campo ambiental, nós temos algumas vitórias e algumas conquistas, como o sucesso na redução do desmatamento na Amazônia no período 2004-2012. E, por fim, não só como um comentário para o professor, mas com toda a audiência, a gente não pode esquecer que, num período pós-pandemia, a Covid nos mostrou que é intolerável a situação do saneamento no Brasil e que o acesso universal à água potável e ao esgotamento sanitário tem que estar entre as prioridades de uma reconstrução desse Estado, porque com as taxas vergonhosas de acesso ao esgotamento sanitário e ao acesso à água, nós conseguimos aprofundar a desigualdade presente no Brasil simplesmente porque milhões de brasileiros não tinham água potável para suprir as suas necessidades e para lavar as mãos, que era a primeira e grande e mais importante medida preventiva contra o Covid. É o que eu tinha a comentar nesse momento. Obrigada.
I'll give the floor to Alexandre Gomide first, okay? Alexandre Gomide holds a PhD in Public Administration and Government from Fundação Getúlio Vargas, São Paulo, with sandwich period at the Department of Political Science in UC, Berkeley. Master degree in Economics from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul and a graduation in Economic Science from UFO. He has been a member of Planning and Research Career of the Institute of Applied Economic Research, IPEA, since 1997. Currently, he holds the position of Head of the Technical Advisory Office of the IPEA Presidency Office. I don't know if this is now, no? He was Director of Regulation and Management of Ministry of Cities, Director of Cooperation and Development of IPEA, Director of State Studies and Policy Institutions and Democracy of IPEA, and Director of Urban Mobility Programs of the Growth Acceleration Program, among other senior management and advisory positions in the federal government and subnational instances. Professor of the Master's Degree in Public Policy and Development of IPEA, collaborating professor of Specialization and Training Courses for Careers of the National School of Public Administration, and Associate Research of INCT in Public Policies, Development and Strategies. Institutional arrangement of public policies, governance, infrastructure programs, regulation, and urban transport are the main areas of interest. Alexandre, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I'm not seeing my, yes, it's here. It changed the, hello, Heide, nice to see you. A great presentation, and I've been following your work with great interest. And I have more questions than a comment. And it's a kind of conceptual and theoretical question. Because as you know, since the classical studies on developmental states, the concept of state capacity has been associated with the Weberian features of public bureaucracy. For the mission-oriented innovation policy that you and Cato, you are working, you have developed the concept of dynamic public sector capabilities. And I'd like to hear more, and I'd like to that you explore more the idea of dynamic capacity, public sector capabilities. Because you mentioned in your presentation that for this kind of the capacity for mission-oriented policies, you need a non-neutral bureaucracy. And if you think in terms of Weber, it's a kind of contradiction, non-neutral. And Bulamark mentioned the case of China, and I've read recently the Yu Yang's book about that called How China Escaped the Poverty Trap, I think. And according to her, he says that the Weberian bureaucracy in the case of China is more an outcome than a cause of the development. And he shows a lot of experience that they have, the country has a very good public service, I don't know how to call it, but these public sector, they don't have the Weberian characteristics of the developmental states. And so I want to listen more, if you could contrast and compare your concept and how to mix the idea of Weberian and Tocquevillian and Schumpeterian bureaucracy. I would like to hear more than that. On the Asian cases, you mentioned in your answer some minutes ago the role of culture to explain the bureaucracy in the states. But I listened recently to an interview with Hajin Cheng that he disagreed with this. He says that in the past, when the first Western people went to Asia, they said that they were animals, they are white, they were individualistic. But now the development changed the culture, not the other way around. And I'd like to point that maybe for you to comment. And finally, I would like to listen from you. I'd like to listen from you the role of politics to deploy existing capabilities or capacities in the states, especially the political leadership and consensus building. I'm asking that because in Brazil, as Estela mentioned some minutes ago, we have a national health system that works in Brazilian terms well. You have a system that had some good capacity. But I think that our disaster in controlling and managing the crisis is more about the political leadership than capacity. And in the case of thinking on mission-oriented policy innovation, I think that's more necessary political leadership and consensus building than capacity. That's my opinion, because you need to build the consensus, to have a strong leadership to manage or to deal with these mission-oriented policies. And so that's some points that I would like to hear more from you about these points. Thank you very much.
Arne, would you like to comment, please?
Yes, of course. So yeah, thanks. Excellent questions and excellent comments. And of course, the comments are so fundamental that I would need, like with Leonardo and Antonetta as well. So I would need more, like another presentation. So I can only do a bit of justice. And that's of course a great pity that we are not physically together, because otherwise we could go for dinner and discuss it, as we used to do it in those great conferences, which were invariably done by Célia, I think. So thanks to Célia here again. I think in a funny way, I think the questions you ask are almost all around the same, not the same question, but they're around a bundle of issues that are very much together. So in terms of like capacities and capabilities, I think the secret is, it's the organizational configurations. It's not that we have only one organization, like, I don't know, BNDES or MITI in Japan, that does it. Yes, those are really important organizations, but you need to have different kinds of organizations around them. Some of them can be and have to be more Weberian, let's say. They are more focused on transparency, accountability, but also stability. Like a lot of public services, the key is that they are, transparent and efficient as well. So if you think about like social services, but also like pension systems. So you don't want really dynamic pension systems, right? You want to have very stable, long-term, 50 years of planning, and that gives you the stability. But you need to have also organizations that are like change agents. Sometimes they are massive, like BNDES used to be a very big, very important change agents. But sometimes these agents can be also much smaller. They can be a smaller agencies and smaller organizations, like FINEP or something else, or IPEA in the Brazilian context. So I think this changes as well. So it's also really important that once we look at these capabilities and capacities, that we build on both. Yes, you want to have agile and dynamic elements in your system. It really depends where the problems are. For instance, as I showed, many governments have really big issues with IT procurement. It's very expensive. The solutions are very bad. So you need to, you need to break up the oligopoly of incumbent companies. So this is where you need to direct your sort of building of capabilities, or the more dynamic capabilities, but also what Leonardo was talking about, for instance, the macro financial architecture. I think we need probably, if you look at the next 5 to 10 years, this will be the key battleground to build different capabilities in central banks, in financial regulators, because at today, most of those regulators come from same economics schools. They study in similar curriculum. So can we break their oligopoly? So I think, and as Leonardo again was saying, it only takes some central bank or some sovereign wealth fund who goes different way and actually shows the way and changes. And in some ways also state-owned companies can play this enormously important role. And so I think my answer to you is that this is really configuration of organizations rather than one organization having this or that. And this really also about the political leadership. I think it's, if you look at modern societies, we are really governed by two types of leadership. One is political, and the other is bureaucratic, which is of course very Weberian. This is Weber's theory of society, basically. And of course he had the third type of traditional authority as well. So I think this is really holds true. And I think in many ways in our societies, we have lost the balance. So we have either political systems are changing either too fast, or there's, what Colbreth called too little countervailing powers. So the unions are much less important than they used to be, for instance. And I think this is what will be the key. Can we build new types of countervailing powers into societies? Are there like the movements around like Black Lives Matters and others, like indigenous peoples, or inequality and against poverty or climate? Will they become like political movements to try to almost to counteract or to counterbalance political changes? Because again, I think the key is that how do you counteract Bolsonaro's and others? So you need to have a core political movement or social movements in your society as well. So how do you support them? I think becomes a really key question. And this is where, as you say, the conflict is with this more sort of mission-oriented approach, because exactly the bureaucrats are then in a very difficult position that they have to sort of tap into social movements around poverty, for instance, at the same time serve the political masters. So you are caught in the middle of it, as I'm sure you probably at the moment are as well. So this is probably something personally that you understand well. So I think this is where we also need to think about the civil service and how do we develop the skills that they are actually getting in schools as well. So I think this is important. And yeah, I think the Chinese case is really interesting in terms of the way political party played the role of enabling experimentation locally in regional governments, but at the same time also building systems of accountability that are not really barbarian, but are actually they function within the party. So the party itself functioned as some sort of a source of countervailing power, and at the same time, space for experimentation as well. So I think this is what we very often forget, that China still today, but especially in 1990s and 2000s, was very open to experimentation by local governments, which doesn't happen in Germany, for instance. Germany is a federal state, but you have much less experimentation in Germany than you had in China. So, and I think, but it was really managed by party system or a political party. And I think they managed this accountability rather well, actually. So if you were corrupt, you were also punished. And so that, I think that was really, really important. Yeah, so, but this is, as I said, I'm sure it doesn't do justice to your questions, but I mean, this is the opening of how I would answer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, and Estela, as much as you can understand, and my Portuguese is not what it used to be. But I haven't been to Brazil for a while, so sorry, but I understood much of it, or partially. So thanks.
I think we have time for 3 more questions from the audience. I'd like to suggest Leonello, Irene, maybe Renuka. Renuka is here, I don't know.
Irene acabou de sair. Escreveu que precisava sair, acabou de sair. Dando parabéns, faz menos de um minuto.
Pois era, justamente eu queria que ela eventualmente fizesse alguma pergunta. Leonello, I have one, but at the end. Leonello? Bom, let me just add just one comment. According to your excellent presentation, I would say that it's possible to separate the new missions into large blocks of missions. One block of missions is to make life easier and better. And this is related to climate change, food, education, health, cities, women, elders. And second, missions to advance the technological and science frontiers. And the building blocks will obviously be in energy transition, we mean cars, different sources of energy, artificial intelligence, neuroscience, health frontiers, as genetic therapies being one of them, sustainability. Thinking about state capabilities or capacities, because they are different, would you say that it's easier to build capacities and capability in one or the other blocks? Because I'm really in doubt. And actually, the second question is about social coalitions, because I'm also convinced that especially for the first block, The second one has an independence, but for the first block of missions, it's really important to know about the social coalitions that governs a nation. So I want to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, brilliant question, Célia. So yeah, I mean, in some ways, of course, your question was asked by Richard Nelson in 1977, I think, in the book The Moon and the Ghetto, which is very much about the same. He asked that, yes, we can solve the mission of putting man on the moon, but we can't solve the inner city poverty. So why can't we do the one and why can't we do the other? And it's it's a brilliant small book. So if you want to, if you haven't read that yet, so I'm sure most of you have. So I think it's very perceptive to say that the missions there are very two types of missions, or two large types of missions, and indeed the one is about lifestyles, very much about the way we live, the way we eat, the way we move around cities, the health, and everything like that, and the other is about technological frontiers. And I think many governments will naturally go towards the technological frontier, even if they are actually not at the frontier. But this is what they know. They have ministries of science, they have ministries of energy, or they have ministries like that. So it's easier to fund these kind of activities. It's easier to say we try to fund artificial intelligence, for instance, or we try to fund renewable energies and things like that. But I think it's much more difficult to change eating habits, for instance, or if you look at a country like UK, the largest carbon emissions actually come from fashion rather than transportation. So there's so much clothing is being wasted in fashion industry that this has become the largest emitter of carbon emissions. So how do you change that is a very different question from artificial intelligence, for instance. I think the first one in that sense is more difficult because, as you say, it requires political and social coalitions. And if you look at countries like Germany, their energy policies, they had 40 years of social movements, of political movements to actually reach. Then you had a prime minister in Angela Merkel who was very willing to support energy industry or the change in energy. So it was decades. It took decades to build social coalitions. Yeah. And the same way in Denmark and other places. So it took decades to build social coalitions. So the question is, do we have time to do that or not? And can we speed this process up? And that, I think, takes a real skill, political skill, but also a real bureaucratic skill as well. How do you speed these things up? So that's why I think it's more difficult to do that. It's much easier to say, let's put more money into artificial intelligence than to change the way we eat. Thank you. Other little links.
Thank you. The floor is open to the audience, please. If you want to make a comment or a question, please. It's time to do it. You still have time.
Well, if nobody is speaking, I will. So let me just add to the dialogue that you, Anna, and Rainer were having, that I think that the political coalitions are crucial in both camps. They are just less difficult to build when you have national security or you have a bunch of very big corporations, which are the big players involved in building that kind of coalition. This is one that builds less difficult, not easier, it's less difficult to build. But when you move to the social agenda and the social areas, etc., obviously it will become much more ideological, much more partisan, and etc. So it will become much more difficult. But I insist, political coalitions are key in both senses, and I underline that because economists generally do not ask any questions about that. It's like political coalitions do not exist in the economist's average discourse. And if we start from there, I don't think we'll go very, we won't be very successful. I think we have to start with the political coalitions in a way, because if we don't have that in place, whatever else we can think about, it's very likely not going to happen. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I very much agree with that. Yeah, absolutely.
There is a question here. What about?
Oh yeah. What about the?
Have you seen in the?
Yeah, I've seen the. What about the evaluation to
Yes.
To build and strengthen state capacity? Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question as well. So how do you actually, you go on and evaluate something like state capacity and capabilities? And so because, of course, we can do it post factum. We can analyze the, as I think Leonardo said, that we learn from history. So we can analyze the cases through history and learn that. But as you go along, I think it's really interesting. How could you do that? And there are some organizations that try to develop tools to analyze, to measure that. For instance, OECD is trying to develop something which is almost like a self-analysis or organization. You go online, you do a survey, and you understand where your strengths and weaknesses are. And I think this is like a one way to think about that, whether you can do that. But yeah, otherwise there is it's a really tough question, I think. How do you measure that? But I think it's also conceptually quite difficult to do, actually, to be honest. But yeah, not that we shouldn't try, but yeah, definitely I agree. That is a need for that.
Well, if you do not have more questions, I think it's time to close our session. Thank you, all of you. And saying that tomorrow we'll have the dos grupos de trabalho, tomorrow morning and in the afternoon. And I hope everyone will be here to present your abstracts, your papers. And we'll certainly will have a very good conversation and discussion in all the GTs. The GTs is the name I wanted to say. So I think that we had an excellent session. I thank you very much indeed. I enjoyed a lot.
Thank you.
This is a very good beginning, starting point for our project between the INCT and IPEA. So it's an extremely interesting starting point. And again, I thank you very much. So I say goodbye, if you please.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye, Rainer. Great to see you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
See you as well.
Hope to be there at some point. Bye.
Yes, absolutely. See you soon, guys. Bye.
Ana, beijo. Beijo todo mundo. Até logo. Obrigado.
Até amanhã.
Bernardo, você queria falar? Bernardo levantou a mão.
Para dar tchauzinho.
Não, ele bateu palma aqui, ele reagiu, bateu
palma. Muito bom. Foi muito bom.
Parabéns, viu? Muito bom.
Paula, você não queria fazer nenhuma pergunta? Abrir a audiência, ninguém se manifestou.